After the overthrow of Rome's last king in a war, Tarquinius Superbus would go into exile, and the Romans would form a new kind of government known as a republic. Now, the Roman Republic was basically meant in order to keep the balance of power from one person, in particular a king-like figure. And the term republic means public good, meaning that the people would elect representatives to make decisions for them in the government. Now, there were different branches of power in the Roman Republic. The Senate of Rome was the most powerful branch, made up of 300 patricians, part of the wealthy ruling class, and the executive branch of Rome was made up of 2 consuls. They were elected every year, and basically the consuls were probably the equivalent of our modern day presidents, and they held considerable power in the government and could veto decisions made by the other consul. And the last branch would be the judicial branch, which is made of judges known as praetors, and they were elected yearly as well by the people of Rome in order to settle things such as civil and criminal cases within the Roman state. Now, ever since Rome's earliest days, there was major differences that caused conflicts between Rome's 2 main classes, the Patricians and the Plebeians. And the Patrician class basically held all the power in the early days of the Republic, and the Plebeians were left without any power or representation. And this would lead to, in 494 BC, the struggle of the orders, and Rome's army was actually mostly made up of plebeian men, and they basically refused service due to the fact that they had little say in Rome's government. And they led a revolt that wasn't your typical kind of revolt, but they revolted by starting their own settlement outside of Rome, which led to many other plebeians within Rome following them. And without plebeians, then the state would not be able to get most of its work done, since most of the actual work was done by the plebeians, or the plebs, as I'll call them. And due to that fact, reforms had to be made, and tribunes were added to Rome's legislative branch, which includes the Senate, with the role of representing the plebs. But that was not enough, and in 451 BC, the plebs would pressure the Senate to write the 12 Tables, a set of laws that was set in Rome's form for all to see, including patricians, meaning that the law, once it was made, it was done. You could not change the law or try to find a loophole around it, as before then a lot of patricians would actually try to do. And then the Licinian law would be passed in 376 BC that would further give the plebs rights, and this basically stated that one of the consuls that was elected yearly to the executive branch of the Roman Republic would have to be from the plebeian class. But there was another part of Rome's government, I would like to call it a branch, because although it wasn't really a branch because it only came around every so often, but it was the dictator. And due to the process of government decision making sometimes taking a long time, in times of distress where swift action must be made, such as during times of war or times of disaster, then the Romans would appoint a dictator, and this was appointed by the Senate. And the dictator made his own decisions without consulting the Senate. And the majority of the dictators that came from Rome's aristocracy or the military class, most of them were military generals, such as Cincinnatus, Camillus, and some others down the line. And this actually worked for a while, actually, as several times Rome faced its existential crisis. They would appoint this dictator that was a military general. The military general would drive out Rome's enemies and restore Rome. But as we will find out many, many years later in the late Republic, that would become, giving a military leader so much power would become a problem. One of the famous dictators of the early Republic was Cincinnatus, and in 458 BC, Rome faced an invasion by some of the neighboring Italian city-states or peoples, and Cincinnatus was a retired consul at the time, and then he decided to take up the role of dictator and defend Rome. And Cincinnatus managed to defeat Rome's enemies, and he basically, after that, he actually just retired from his post at dictator after only 16 days in the office. And due to this, actually Cincinnatus would become an admired figure for many in centuries to come due to his humility, in which he did not hold on to absolute power even if he had the opportunity. But we can't say the same for other Roman dictators, however, as we will find out years later. Now, one of the earliest enemies of Rome, if not the earliest enemy of Rome, that caused an existential crisis for Rome was the Gauls. And the Gauls were a Celtic people that they lived in what is now modern-day France, Pannonia, parts of Britain, and even a small part of Spain. Some of them even migrated down to Anatolia, as you see in the map below. And the Gauls were a Celtic people, and the Celts spread throughout Europe at this time, and there was a great Celtic migration even. But the Gauls were never a unified people. They were made up of many different small tribes that were all ruled by chieftains, such as the Averni, the Semnones, Galatians, and they lived in more simplistic villages, but they were very good craftsmen and they were very good warriors. And around this time, one of the tribes, as mentioned before, the Semnones, began moving into central Italy, and their leader was known as Brennus. And they carved out a path of destruction throughout central Italy. They conquered, sacked parts of the Etruscans to the north, and then marched towards Rome itself. And at the Battle of Allia, Brennus's Gauls would meet the Romans, and the center of Rome's battle line was made up of men fighting in the phalanx formation, typically used by Greeks. And you have to remember that this is the very early days of Rome, so Rome was very much inspired by Greek ways in terms of culture, as well as warfare in its early days. This is long before the Roman legions and maniples and all of that. So the Romans basically fought like Greeks in their early days. And the Roman flanks at the time in this battle was made up of poorly armed men, even though their center was made of trained hoplites. And due to that fact, the Gauls were able to rout the flanks of Rome and then surround the Roman army and then annihilate them. And this battle would go down as Rome's first serious military defeat in its history. And following the Battle of Allia, Brennus and his Gauls marched on Rome itself, and one of the accounts tells us that there were sacred geese living in one of the Roman temples on the Capitoline Hill, made noises because they heard something approaching, and that's how the Romans were warned of the advancing Gauls. But that wouldn't really save the city though, because the Gauls would actually sack Rome, and that was the first ever sack of Rome. But it wasn't over, and the Gauls turned south towards some Roman settlements, and an exile Roman named Camillus organized local forces to defend his city. And they caught the advancing Gauls, who were distracted by their spoils at night, and many Gauls were killed in the ensuing battle. And due to Camillus' victory, the Senate appointed him as dictator. Camillus would go on to march against Brennus himself, and Brennus and the surviving Gauls were still besieging and plundering Rome, and the Romans attempted to negotiate a peace through payment, but Brennus tried to use heavier weights than standard for weighing gold, so that he could get more money. And when the Romans told him that that was unfair and that was unjust, Brennus threw his sword and belt on the scales and shouted Vae Victis, meaning woe to the conquered. And this basically means that the person or people who are conquered is basically subject to whatever decisions made by those who conquered them. But according to Roman historians, though, at this very moment, Camillus arrived with a Roman army in front of Brennus and put his sword on the scale, saying, Non auro sed ferro recuperanda est patria. This meant, not with gold, but with iron will the fatherland be avenged. And a battle would ensue, and the Gauls were routed in the field by Camillus, and Rome was saved. Camillus was actually dubbed as a second Romulus for his heroism in defending Rome as well as rebuilding Rome from the ashes after the Gallic sack. And as you remember, the main founder of Rome is Romulus, the first king of Rome. And while Rome was being reconstructed, some of the Italian peoples, like the Volsci, the Aequi, and the Etruscans and Latin rebels, attacked the Romans from all directions, as Rome was always fighting their neighbors. And Camillus was appointed the dictator a second time, and he defeated the Volsci at Maesium and conquered the Aequi, and drove out the Etruscans and the Latins, as well as even reconquering some of the lost territory. And the wars between the Romans and these early Italian foes would not end, as in the next episode we'll cover the Roman conquest of Italy. And after all of these victories, Camillus celebrated a triumph in Rome, and he would actually serve as a dictator 5 times due to the fact that there was going to be further invasions, because the Gauls would try to invade again but be defeated again, and there were also incursions from the Italian neighbors as well. And because of that, he served as dictator 5 terms, probably some of the most out of a Roman general. And the Gauls, although they were defeated from now, this won't be the last time that we encounter them in our Roman histories, as we all know what will happen years later in the late Republic, Gallic Wars. But with that is the end of this episode on Rome's early Republic and some of the turbulent events that happened in terms of Rome's foreign relations, Rome's government.